Welcome. Today we are in session 8. We'll be talking about the kingdom or the monarchy of Israel, and this will consist of the stories of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. So we'll look forward to just looking at that period of time. The highlight of that period of time is going to actually be the covenant that God gives to David. And Nathan the prophet is going to reveal this covenant to David as God instructs him. And in part, here are some of the words of Nathan to David. The word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a kingdom for you, a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by man, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." The United Monarchy is a period of time that is going to emerge after the years of the Judges, years which lasted nearly 400 years, where for the greater part Israel has done all sort of wickedness, and they do whatever evil that they wish to, and God has sent judges to deliver them. Well, in the context of all of that, the people, looking around at all of the nations, decide that they would like to have a king, as all of the other nations do. They have lost their sense of identity as a people of God. They seemingly have little or no sense of the fact that God has called and distinguished them out, and they are to be a people who are to be separated to God so that they can in fact bless the rest of the world. So they've come to a place now where their desire is not to be distinct, but to be just like the other nations, just like the world, and from which they had been called apart. So they ask for a king. This is somewhat of a double-edged sword. For the people themselves are simply bowing down to the world in which they live, and they just kind of want to fit in and be able to have the kinds of benefits that they see the other nations have. But yet at the same time, God previously had said that there would be a king. The primary difference is this. Israel's desire to have a king was nothing other than the desire to be like everybody else. God's desire to provide a king for them was just the very opposite. That the king would be a mediator, be someone who reflects the reign or the rule of God among his people. So, although both the people and God had said there would be a king, they're really coming at this from two very, very different perspectives. In Israel's case, wanting to fit in to the world. From God's perspective, from God's case, wanting to be separated and distinct from the world, so that in fact he could use that distinction to reveal himself to the world. So God is going to honor, or God's going to grant the request of the people. And in so doing, we start the story with the birth of Samuel. And Samuel's birth will sound very much like some of the cycles of stories that we encountered in the book of Genesis, where a mother, like Sarah or Rebecca, Rachel, where a mother through whom the promises of God are going to continue is barren, cannot have children. And this story features, a story with Samuel features the very same theme coming all the way back around again. Hannah is Samuel's mother, and she too is barren and has been wanting to have a child, and she goes and prays. And God hears her cries, and she conceives, and her son Samuel, after she births him, at some point in time, she takes him and gives him to the priest to be raised, as a way of saying that she is dedicating back to God the son that God had given her. Samuel then becomes somewhat of the bridge person between the times of the judges and all of that chaos and the rise of the monarchy, of the kings. And Samuel proves to be a man of God, man of integrity, a man who listens to God. And he actually serves in various roles. He actually is the last of the judges. He also serves in the role of a priest, and he also serves as a prophet. Just as an interesting note, it seems as if Samuel himself had some desire to actually serve as a king, or the king of Israel, but that just was not to be. And as the people revolted, God came to Samuel and affirmed to him that the revolt and the displeasure of the people was not directed against Samuel, but was directed against none other than God himself. So Samuel becomes the one then who fills in this era of time, and he is the one that God uses to anoint Saul and David. So Samuel has a very distinctive kind of ministry, and although he probably wanted to be king himself, he will become a kingmaker. He will be the voice of God. He will help steer the nation through some very troublesome times. The first king that is going to be anointed or appointed will be Saul. He is kind of a people's choice king. He is handsome, he is tall, he has head and shoulders above everyone else, and he becomes Israel's first king. Let me remind you that, by the way, with these stories of the kings, that the same thing that was true of the book of Joshua and Judges is still true, and that is that the theme that all of the stories of the kings are founded upon and rest upon is the theme of the covenant of God. So, as you could probably already imagine or foresee, God is keeping his part of the covenant, and he is doing so in light of the reality that just like in Judges, the people are rebellious. The people live in cycles in which it's almost as if they intentionally seek to breach the covenant. So we're going to see some of that again with the kings. The thing that holds the stories of Saul and David and Solomon together is really the larger story of God's covenant and how Israel responds to that, and things that happen in each of those kings' lives, which in fact jeopardize the covenant, and which would be nothing less than breaches of the covenant itself. So, Saul is the first king, and the Bible really doesn't spend a tremendous amount of time with Saul, and the time that it does talk about him, it does so in terms of his covenant breaches. One of those moments happened when Saul was preparing for a battle, and it was customary for the soldiers to be consecrated and for a sacrifice to be offered. And it looked as if perhaps from Saul's perspective that the moment of battle or possible victory in battle was passing, and Samuel had not showed up yet to offer the sacrifice that would consecrate his army and prepare them for battle. So Saul took it upon himself from the role of a king to act like a priest. And so he took a sacrifice, offered it, and sure enough, as you would probably expect, just about as soon as all of that was done, here comes Samuel, and Samuel calls him out on this because Saul has in fact stepped beyond his boundary. This is a covenant breach. Saul is certainly a king, but he is not a priest. And his decision to make the sacrifice, to consecrate the army, was an act that only a priest could perform. And so in this story, in this experience, we have a pretty significant moment in which Saul breaches this covenant. He does it again in a different way in a subsequent battle. God had placed a ban on a group of people, the Amalekites, and just like there was a ban of destruction upon the city of Jericho when the people of God crossed over the Jordan River and took that city, so now there is a similar ban on the Amalekites. Saul's army goes in and they defeat the Amalekites, but the purpose of the ban is that there would be full destruction of the Amalekites, their possessions, their livestock. Saul, however, like the other kings in other nations, breaches this covenant by saving the life of the king of the Amalekites and by keeping the very best of the livestock. So here again we see that the people, and now even reflected in their first king, are very much a people who are acting like, poising themselves as if they are just like the other nations of the world. So, as time goes on, God rejects Saul as king, but Saul is still living and he doesn't accept that rejection. David, by this time, has been anointed by Samuel to be the king, and David has quite a victorious story apparently as a young man, where he goes out and defeats the giant Goliath. And very much like the stories of Moses and Pharaoh, in which the storyline, at least on the historical front, appears as if it is the contest between Moses and Pharaoh, is really the contest between the God of Moses and the gods of the Egyptians. The same thing is true in the story of David and Goliath. It certainly is quite an interesting and entertaining, powerful story. The real storyline is, however, that the God of David defeats the gods, or the God of Goliath, the Philistines. So David already on his resume has this incredible face-off with Goliath. And as time goes on, Saul just goes more crazy with all of this. And there is popular affection for David. And Saul's madness even leads him to the place where, or a couple of times in which David comes in and he is requested to play his harp before Saul to just offer some comfort and soothing of his very restless soul. And Saul takes a spear and throws it at David. So Saul is just mad king, trying to now, of all things, kill off the one who will ultimately succeed him. Saul also sends some of his men kind of raiding David's place one night in hopes of killing him. And then, can you imagine this? Saul the king kind of chases David throughout the wilderness, almost in hide-and-seek kind of fashion, and David hides here, he moves here, or he's in a cave, and Saul is in pursuit of him, but never kills David. In fact, on 2 occasions, David had clear opportunity to kill Saul, and part of this story of David's character and integrity is that when he had those moments, he did not exercise the moment to kill off the king Saul and just go ahead and assume. So ultimately there is a battle in which Saul and his sons go to fight. The sons are killed. Saul is deeply wounded in the battle. He's injured. He knows he's going to die. And at the end of the story, Saul, in fact, just falls on his own sword, rather than it having been said of him that he was killed by the enemy. So the story of Saul, King Saul, passes the scenes. David now becomes the ruler, and there are several things that David is able to do that are quite effective, are quite king-like. One is that you will recall that the tribes of Israel have been divided over the land of Canaan, the 12 tribes, the 10 northern tribes, and then the 2 southern tribes, and the 10 northern tribes kind of had a growing identity, and the 2 southern tribes had something of a growing identity, and there was a sense of some uneasiness between the 10 in the north, the 2 in the south, and David actually belonged to one of the 2 in the south. And in an attempt as king to seek to provide common space and to help unite the people of the kingdom. David wisely chose the city of Jerusalem, which was between the two kingdoms, as a capital city, and in so doing, he defeated the Jebusites, who were the occupants of that city, and once they are gone, David moves into that city and features it as the capital city. He also recaptures the ark that the Philistines had, and brings that, the Ark of the Covenant, brings that to the city. So David has provided a place, a capital city, where the people can share commonality, and people in the north, people in the southern kingdoms could share together. And he has also provided a place where the Ark of the Covenant can reside. In the midst of all of that, God has also sent the prophet Nathan to relay to David that God is going to establish a covenant with David. It is a very incredible covenant. In many ways, it echoes the covenant that God had made to Abraham of a people and land and blessing and those kind of things. And those kinds of things are going to be extended through David. But there is a little more to this covenant, because God is not going to just extend that which he had already covenanted with Abraham. He's going to actually extend the family and the throne of David so that they will live forever, so that the dynasty or the throne will be forever. So that is certainly quite a word of covenant and word of promise from God through Nathan to David. But as this story unfolds with David, we're going to see that a great deal of the story, a good portion of it, is actually given to a side of David, to an event, to an experience in David's life in which the covenant that God has offered him is jeopardized so very much, just like we have seen so many times in the past. In this case, as you know, a time of war had come, and David had many military victories, and for whatever reasons, at this particular time of battle, David did not go out with his men to battle as was the custom, and he stayed home in the capital. He saw Bathsheba, requested that she be brought to him. He and Bathsheba and David engages in this adulterous affair with Bathsheba. She becomes pregnant. Her husband is one of the warriors that is fighting on behalf of David in the kingdom. When David gets word that Bathsheba is pregnant, he panics somewhat and tries to bury or cover this story. And I'm sure from his perspective, as a move that would probably just make it possible for life to go on and this whole incident go undetected by all, David ordered that Uriah be placed on the front line of battle. That order was followed. What David had intended, in fact, happened. Uriah was killed in battle. And with that, it was certainly hoped that as Bathsheba would carry and ultimately deliver this child, that the assumption certainly among the people would be that this was Uriah's child. However, God sent the same prophet to David that he had sent before when God told David about the covenant that he was extending through him. So back comes Nathan. And Nathan confronts David with a story, with a very powerful parable. And as Nathan tells that story and asks for King David's advice, the very advice that David gives in response to that story is the very advice that will become the ruin of any possibility of this story being undetected. And so David is exposed. He is uncovered in the activity that he has participated in. It is now known that he had called Bathsheba. He is the father of the child that she bears, and that he is responsible for the murder of her husband in war, or he set that up so that he would be killed in war. So it is an amazing thing. Everybody knows the story of David, Bathsheba, Uriah. What you need to keep in mind through this story is that what we are really looking at through this story is not just that these events happened and David just had this, he just had a stellar resume going into this thing. But this is really a story that is told because it impacts the covenant of God with his people. It reveals yet again how faithful God is, and yet in our own frailty, and even as one, as King David, how all of this can so quickly unravel in his frailty, in his humanity. Obviously, as you know and recall, David repents of these series of deeds, and he is restored by God, but the impact of what he has done and the consequence of that certainly is far and wide. It impacts the family stories of David, things that happen with his sons and daughters, the fighting, the turmoil, just the absolute family turmoil that resulted is heart-wrenching. It also resulted in turmoil for the nation itself. So, David has had quite a story. One of David's great dreams was to build a house where God would live in Jerusalem, but God's plan was for that to be another day, another person, a son of David, Solomon. So after the reign of David, King Solomon assumes his rule as king, and this is the king that asked God for wisdom, and he is the king that prepared the nation and the workforce and the labor and all of the resources that would be necessary for the construction of the temple of God that would be in Jerusalem. A project that was massive, expensive, even required that King Solomon use some of his own people, conscript them in to slave-like labor. Yet the project, when it is completed, is a beautiful, massive architectural wonder in which God will reign or which God will reside. And there's the account of a beautiful worship service in which the glory of God fills the place, and it would certainly be fair to say that through all that has happened, Israel now, from all appearances, is at a really good place. They are militarily strong, they are economically prosperous. They have finally come to the place where God is residing in the city itself. They have a glorious and wonderful temple. And yet, in all of this, the unbelievable seeds of decay and demise begin to express and manifest themselves. Somehow through all of this, King Solomon, with all the wisdom that he had, with the temple that he had built, with the history that was behind him, managed to find his way into idolatry, the very thing that the God of the temple stood against. And all that he had done in that temple effort, it's almost as if he walked away from and lived a life that shouted loudly that he was now embracing all of the other gods of all of the other nations. So this so-called golden era, if you just peel back a layer of that, is really not so golden after all. For in it we see the seeds of our sin, our humanity, our frailty, our disobedience to God, and almost again, how God has reached out and provided through Abraham, through David, a covenant that will last forever, and how quickly it seems as if that covenant can be breached. So, as you meet together this week, I hope you have some really interesting conversation about the kings, and you'll be able to make some good application of how, for example, institutions that God has given to us to protect us, to help us to live in relationship with Him, and to help us to live in healthy relationship with each other. Institutions like kingship, or institutions like marriage, or other institutions that you might wish to talk about, it would probably be an interesting conversation to consider talking about those institutions in terms of what happens when God establishes institutional type life for us to live in, and what we do when our brokenness and when our sin kind of gets into the very things that God intends to bless us with, and to bless life, and to bless humanity, and to bless relationships. So you may want to talk about that. Perhaps you would like to just have a really fun conversation about the covenant that God made with David, and that this son of David that Nathan spoke about, and how through the larger sweep, the son of David, certainly Solomon, but how that actually becomes something of a messianic type image for another son who would come. So I hope that you will have a great time exploring the stories of the monarchy of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon.